This second introduction video will cover a couple of the main themes and main things that you should be considering as you're preparing for our next quiz. By the way, the quiz is due March 21st, so be mindful of that. But in preparing for that quiz, let me underscore a couple things and tell you what to expect. Now, your reading assignments for this semester, there's a examination of a couple different localities, a couple local communities in Appalachia. But really, the thing that organizes this unit is Chapter 4 in High Mountains Rising by the great historian, the foremost historian of the Civil War and Reconstruction period, still writing in Appalachian history, is Gordon McKinney. The Civil War and Reconstruction. I think that chapter is pretty self-explanatory, and more than any other article or any other place, I think McKinney really summarizes all the main debates and all the main current thinkings about the Civil War in the Appalachian region. Again, with most of the chapters in High Mountains Rising, it's self-explanatory, and you should see some of the main themes in that very well-written and edited book emerging. But you do have a couple, though, this next group of readings requires some thought, and indeed one of our discussion questions asks you to compare and contrast it. What I want you to do is be able to compare and contrast two local places in Appalachia, Barbour County, and you do have a great article by a historian by name John W. Schaefer, who, by the way, has written an entire book on Barbour County during the Civil War. But anyways, just his one article, Loyalties and Conflict, Union and Confederate Sentiment in Barbour County. A little background to this piece. There is a debate among historians and among historians of Appalachia, not only of Appalachia, but also the South and generally the Civil War, over what influenced people's decisions to join up either with the secessionists or the Federalists during the Civil War. And this is actually a debate that goes actually back to the Civil War itself, as Union troops were going through the region. Some Union commanders observed that those who were secessionists were usually the younger men who didn't have much to lose, and that the Unionists were the older established families who had much to lose. However, since then, historians have made all sorts of adjustments to this, and indeed Schaefer weighs in on this by looking at the economic conditions and the social conditions that influenced Barbour County, and how Barbour County really was fractured between Unionists and secessionists during the Civil War. A couple larger points to bear in mind that go along with Schaefer's piece. Number one of which is that Appalachia, of course, was a border region during the Civil War. It was the northernmost southern place and the southernmost northern place, and all these aspects overlap one another. So actually, Barbour County is typical in that there were Union and secessionist camps right next to one another in the war. Number one. Number two, and actually John Alexander Williams weighs in on this, and actually is a different look than what Schaefer would suggest. Schaefer says we have to consider all these different economic and social conditions behind people's decision to either secede or become a secessionist or remain loyal to the Union. John Alexander Williams explains it in the simplest terms, and it seems almost like a cop-out, but nonetheless it's a fair appraisal. John Alexander Williams would have us understand the decision Appalachians confronted in terms of just self-interest. Yeah, those regions and those families whose self-interest were served by staying within the Union stayed with the Union. Those families whose interests would have been served by seceding from the Union went with the Confederacy. It's an oversimplification, but in many ways it it does work, and to explain the way in which some parts of Appalachia remained loyal to the Union and some parts actually seceded from the Union. Which is actually the case of Cades Cove, and I think there's a lot to be said about the great work by Durer done on Cades Cove. Cades Cove by Durer Dunn. Now you just read one chapter in the larger work, but I do recommend the entire book. I used to sign the entire book, Cades Cove: The Life and Death of the Southern Community, for Appalachian history. However, I've gotten away from that, and typically though I'll have one or two chapters from Durer Dunn. We'll just have one chapter this semester. But what Durer Dunn does is he takes Cades Cove all the way from its founding. Really, it was just a couple families in the Appalachian frontier who founded this community, all the way up into the 1930s, when it was taken over by the federal government and made part of the Smoky Mountain National Forest. By the way, if you ever get down to that region, you can still tour Cades Cove and some of the homes that remain from the community there. Now, with Durer Dunn's Cades Cove, a couple key things to bear in mind as you're understanding that reading. Number one is how the how Appalachian communities were frayed by the Civil War. So be able to use Cades Cove as an example of how the Civil War frayed Appalachian communities. And number two, how Appalachian communities had new roles for women to play during the course of the war. It's subtle, but read very carefully. What did the women do in Cades Cove during the Civil War? What new opportunities would have been present for them because of the Civil War? And lastly, we have a great essay, Slavery's End in East Tennessee. This is an important essay for a number of reasons, is because, number one, we have to bear in mind that slavery was in fact a part of Appalachia. Not all parts of Appalachia. It was different than in the South. So as you're reading this essay, this chapter in the larger work, Appalachians and Race, the Mountain South from Slavery to Segregation, which, by the way, is on Net Library. Bear in mind the unique attributes of slavery in Appalachia. Now, this is something we'll pick up in our second unit, the next unit, Unit 4 on Industrialization. We'll return to the idea of slavery, but at least for the purposes of this unit, do note the unique attributes of slavery in East Tennessee, number one. And number two, the unique impact that the Civil War had on those slaves in East Tennessee. How did the Civil War impact them differently than it did whites? Not only during the war, but also in the aftermath of the war. So bear that in mind. Okay, so that covers the readings. Do look, I will get a brief lecture on the Hatfield and McCoys up probably tomorrow, but certainly in plenty of time for your next quiz. And also an essay on a brief lecture on John Henry, who fits nicely. The whole saga of John Henry fits nicely in with the essay on Slavery's End in East Tennessee. So look for those coming up later on this week.